Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
And welcome to today's Ho-Onko service, which is a memorial for Shinran Shonin. My claim to fame, being Reverend Marvin's neighbor back in the 1980s, when we were in our 20s, was that when his first child, Ricky, was born. My wife Naomi and I were his first babysitters. And let me tell you, he cried the entire time. Well, we are here to observe the memorial service or Ho-Onko service for Shinran Shonin. And it is through his eyes and through his experiences and through his words that we are able to follow the Buddhist path of Jodo Shinshu, Pure Land Buddhism. And many of the assumptions that we have about Buddhism are actually thanks to Shinran. For example, that everyone is capable of coming to a deep understanding about their life, that you need not be a priest or a monk and follow strict austerities like extreme meditation, fasting, study, to come to this understanding. And that we're basically all equal. We're fellow travelers on this path. And these were the values and the teachings of Shinran Shonin. And I am part of the Higashi Honganji tradition. And so in a nutshell, I'd like to kind of talk about that history. And when Shinran passed away, his daughter, Kakushini, built a mausoleum, a place for his ashes, at her family's home on the east side of Kyoto. And that mausoleum, this building, people visited to pay their respects to Shinran and show their appreciation for his teachings. And that building became known as the first Honganji temple. And so for the next 150 years, there was this Honganji temple and other temples sprung up. And Renyo Shonin, whose image is up there on the left side, he was the abbot of that Honganji temple 150 years after Shinran's passing. And about 100 years after that, this one Honganji temple had grown into a gigantic organization, much like the Catholic Vatican in Rome had a huge following, had their own army. And this was during the samurai warring years in which Japan was not a unified country, but a patchwork of territories run by feudal warlords. And those warlords are fighting each other, and so Honganji had to protect itself with its own army. And eventually the country was unified. So the split of Honganji is linked to that history in that period of time, beginning with one of the first military rulers of Japan, samurai rulers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then later with Tokugawa Ieyasu. So I won't go into that, but basically 400 years ago, the Honganji temple was split, and since that time, both organizations were established and have existed. And so we, at Higashi, we follow the same teachings of Jodo Shinshu that Nishi Honganji follows. And there are some differences. For example, our Ho-Onko service was held in November following the modern solar calendar, and the Nishi Honganji follows a lunar calendar, which is why Ho-Onko is observed in January. And for example, we wear similar robes, although the style is a little bit different, the chanting is different, and we have a long nenju, ojuzu, like Reverend Harada's carrying, but we hold it tassel side up. So all of these differences. And if one were to talk about a difference in approach towards understanding the teachings and expressing the teachings, the Higashi side is characterized by the teachings of Manshi Kiyozawa, who lived around the turn of the century in 1900, who studied Western philosophy and who interpreted Jodo Shinshu from his own personal experience standpoint and using more Western language and kind of a psychological, understanding to Jodo Shinshu and using less of the traditional formal language of Jodo Shinshu. And so you might kind of consider the Higashi approach more liberal or contemporary in some ways. And so I'd like to kind of address that in my talk today. And one of the things, one of the expressions that I sometimes hear Nishi ministers say, and things that lay people at BCA temples might say at a funeral or memorial service, is that the person who has passed away has gone to the Pure Land or was born in the Pure Land. And in Higashi Honganji ministers never say that, or usually never say that kind of expression. And we are encouraged to focus more on the here and now, which you hear a lot about in Buddhism. And it is not wrong to say those words. Those words are found in the teachings. But my fear is that using those words so freely can lead to a misunderstanding, misinterpretation of the teachings of Shinran and of Buddhism. And but having said that, I'd like to tell you how once recently a woman, I was at a lunch and a woman sat down next to me and she wanted to ask me a question. And so she told me about how her mother was terminally ill and was on hospice care. And so they had called their minister and who came, and her mother didn't have long to live. And so she told me that this minister said, well, in this time that you have, you should really appreciate it and really appreciate the family who comes to see you and your friends, and just try to live in the moment and appreciate your time together like this. But this woman who was telling me the story didn't seem to be very happy with this minister's guidance at the time. So she asked me, what would you say? And so I sensed her dissatisfaction, right? And I told the woman, oh, I have no problem looking her in the eye, looking your mother in the eye, and saying, don't worry, you'll go to the Pure Land. So I just said that Higashi ministers usually never say that expression, but I've got no problem saying it. But I think that a person at that point in life understands those words in a different way, and those words have a deeper meaning and a greater significance, and I think those words are helpful at that time. So the words are a means towards understanding, or a conveyance. We say hoben. But just to talk about it, when we're not facing death, I think can lead to a misunderstanding. In Berkeley, we have visitors who sometimes come to the temple, and I remember there were a group of Boy Scouts who came with their parents, or Cub Scouts. And so I gave my 10-minute explanation of the temple and of Buddhism. So I said, now, are there any questions? So a father raised his hand, and he said, yeah, I have a question. What happens to Buddhists when they die? Oh, what do you mean? Where do they go? And I said, well, my short answer is, it's all about the here and now. And then he said, well, what about reincarnation? I said, well, there's no reincarnation. like that. But I realized that that answer is very, I know he wasn't satisfied by that answer, and that answer was not really a good answer, but that's a short answer. But I have to say that the Buddha did not deny, was not a denier. So if you read the sutras, you don't hear the Buddha saying, well, no, there's no afterlife, or the Buddha did not even say there's no such thing as God, right? In fact, there are references to gods and spirits and angels and magical beings and all that, but in the sutras. So it's not about denying anything, but the point of the sutras and the Buddha's sermons was to understand truth about life. And so the problem that I have with saying that one goes to the Pure Land is that, well, if a person is not here, if it's not here, then it's there, somewhere else, right? So that means there are two different places. So this way of thinking is duality, where you divide the world up into two parts. And Buddhism is about non-duality, that everything is one. Everything is one. So already we get into trouble just using these words. And of course we live in a Christian society, and so the term Pure Land is really evokes a feeling of heaven, a sense of heaven. And so people, I think, kind of generalize their thinking a lot of times, thinking about after death, one is born or goes to the Pure Land, and Pure Land is a place like heaven. So this is all very, very problematic from a philosophical point of view, from Buddhist philosophy, right? Because Buddhism emphasizes oneness, a world of non-duality, where the world is not divided up into life and death. In fact, one of the answers to why is there death, the Buddha answers, because there is birth, right? You can't have birth without death, right? But really, there's no such thing as birth, because if you look at the birth, for example, of an orange, like at what point was this orange born? When it fell off a tree? No, it was actually growing on the tree. Well, when it was just a bud on a branch, well, it was, you can't cut off the point. Or with the birth of that tree, when it was just the seed, well, it came from another orange, which came from another tree. There's no point in which you could cut off and say that orange was truly born. And it's the same with our lives. Our life is the result of a continuous stream of lifetimes that have come together and that we are connected to, and that at no point was that stream cut off. So there's no one here that didn't have parents or didn't have grandparents. Life did not skip a generation. It's a continuous one. So in that sense, there is no such thing as birth. So we have to be very careful in how we use words and how we understand. And you could see examples of these teachings in the basic stories that we have in Buddhism. And one is called the Golden Silence. And you can look this one up on the internet if you Google it, Golden Silence. But in one sutra, the Buddha is approached by a person wanting to know the answers to certain questions. And one of the questions is, what was this world before it existed, before it was created? Did it exist or did it not exist? And the Buddha sat there in silence. And so this person asked, what will happen to this world after it disappears? Will it exist, or will it not exist, or will it exist and not exist at the same time? And the Buddha sat there in silence. And this person asked, what will happen to you, great teacher, after you disappear from this earth? Will you exist or will you not exist? And the Buddha sat there in silence. So this is the great silence. And of course, this person was not satisfied by the answer, and he thought, well, this person does not know the answers to these questions. That's why he is not answering. And so the Buddha then proceeded to give the parable of the poison arrow. And so he said, suppose there was a man who was shot by a poison arrow, and he is bleeding. And before he is treated, before that arrow could be pulled out, this man asked, before you pull out the arrow, I must know, who shot this arrow? Was he tall or was he short? Was he educated or was he uneducated? Was he rich or was he poor? It is like this man asking these questions. These feathers on this arrow, did they come from a peacock or did they come from an eagle? To answer those questions is like the man asking these questions that are not important. He says, I treat suffering. This is my concern with the dharma that I teach, the truth that I teach, is to treat the suffering. So the Buddha was known as the great physician. This is one of the names that is used in describing the Buddha, the great physician. And there are statues in Buddhist art that you'll see, the medicine Buddha. And the medicine Buddha is holding in his palm a little bottle like this, or holding it from the tip, from his side. So this is the medicine Buddha. And people in China, for example, they pray to the medicine Buddha because they're sick or their loved one is sick, hoping that this Buddha will cure their loved one or cure their own illness. But this isn't the point of the medicine Buddha. The medicine Buddha, the Buddha treats suffering. Right? And as you know, there are the Four Noble Truths. And so the first noble truth is, in life there is suffering. And the second noble truth is, suffering is caused by ignorance. And the third noble truth is, if you eliminate ignorance, then you eliminate suffering. So in the bottle that the medicine Buddha holds is not medicine like we think of, but it is wisdom. Wisdom is the Buddha's treatment for ignorance, for suffering. So you see this man's suffering from the poison arrow is not physical suffering, but it is suffering from his ignorance. And so now when I look at that question from that father, what happens after death? Or what happens when we die? Like, where do we go? It is a disservice for us to say, we go to the Pure Land, even though that might be technically correct. Well, we go to the Pure Land, but we're already in the Pure Land. Well, the Pure Land's already around us because we live, we are part of the world of oneness. We just don't know it, something like that. You could justify saying, so when we say we go to the Pure Land, well, we're already in the Pure Land. So technically that's correct. We go there, we're already there, whatever you want to say, it's fine. But we're doing a disservice because we're not really addressing the true problem that's being asked. And when I think about that question, and I think about the Buddha or Siddhartha sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, right, trying to understand life, it's like, why is one asking that question in the first place? Well, if you analyze where that question is coming from, it's because we want to know. Well, why do we want to know? Well, because I'm thinking someday it's going to happen, and I want to know what's going to happen. Well, why do you have to know? Why, just let it be. Well, I want to know because I don't know, right? Why can't you just accept that? Well, because it's causing me anxiety. Well, why is it causing, what do you mean anxiety? Well, actually, it's causing me some fear. I fear, right? Well, why do you have fear? Because I don't know, right? And so if you keep peeling back the layers of this question, it comes down to because we don't understand our life. This is the problem. And so the problem is, the Buddha said, the problem with ourselves, with human nature, is that we are people filled with desires. This is what human nature is all about, and desire causes us problems. So one of the problems that we have is impermanence, right? That life is constantly changing, that we're getting older, and our bodies become sick, and we're not always well, and these are problems. And we lose loved ones, and we don't like that. So if you think about, how do I solve this problem? By creating a place that solves these problems for me, right? And so there's a place I could think of in my mind. There must be, called the Pure Land, or called heaven. And in this place called heaven, it's a land of permanence. It is a place where I can have eternal life. It is a place where I never get old, where I'm always happy. This is a place of permanence, right? So how was this place created? It was created in answer to our desires. It is another way for us to fulfill our desires, if we think about it this way. We have the three treasures. And the three treasures in our service book, it's a little bit different than what's in your service book, but the essence is the same. And the wording that we use in the three treasures is, hard is it to be born into human life. Now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the teachings of the Buddha. Now we hear it. If we do not awaken in this life, then in what life can we hope to awaken, right? So the three treasures is encouraging us to come to a deep understanding about our life, to understand who we are in this life. If you're unhappy in this life, I think the reason for this question, what happens, is there an afterlife? The reason for that question is because this life is not, it's because we're dissatisfied in this life. This life is not cutting it for us, right? There's something wrong with this life. So we think, well, the next life must be better. It must be the place where I'm eternally happy, right? But if you're not happy in this life, if you're dissatisfied in this life, what makes you think you're going to be satisfied in the next life? Because you just keep asking for more. Well, I'm not happy, but the next life will be perfect. The Buddha is telling us that no, this life is important. This is the important life. So the Buddha is not saying whether there's a life, there's an afterlife or not. That's not the point. The point is this life, understanding this life. So this is the important thing. So this is what the here and now is all about. And I read an interesting article in the newspaper recently that was written by a philosophy professor who talked about Aristotle's understanding of time. And from Aristotle's understanding of time, this philosophy professor, he came up with these two terms. One is telic, which means goal-oriented. And he said one way that we live life in terms of time is it's very goal-oriented. For example, we might think to ourselves, if we're young, I can't wait to get married because once I get married, I'll finally achieve happiness. But as you know, thank you very much. As you know, if you've ever been married, that's only the start of your troubles. Or if you're a student, you think, oh, I can't wait until I graduate, then I'll be done with school, right? So in that case, your happiness lies in the past, in this past event. And looking forward to getting married, your happiness lies in a future event. It does not lie in the present, right? It's either in the past or in the future. But the goal disappears, and then you have to establish another goal, right? Because the whole point of having this goal-oriented life is achieving the goal. But once you achieve the goal, that goal disappears, and then you need another goal. But there's another way of understanding life, which is called atelic, a being a negation of the word. So atelic means no goal. So this would be where the activity that you're doing is accomplishing the goal itself, is the goal. So for example, spending time with a loved one. There's no end to spending time with a loved one. If you're spending time, that's what you're supposed to be doing, and that's what you're enjoying, and you hope that time doesn't end, but it does. But what you're doing is fulfillment, Or, for example, standing up for human rights. You can never stand up for human rights enough, right? For injustice, for equality, for unfairness, right? We can't do that enough. When we're doing it, we're happy, we're pleased, we're fulfilling our lives by doing it, right? There's no end to it. It's not like we do it enough and we're done with it. As long as we're doing it, we're achieving what we're supposed to be doing. So this is a telic way of looking at time. So when I read this article, I was thinking, this is Buddhism. Because Buddhism is about here and now, we should be appreciating this life, really be fulfilled by this life. And the telic way, this achieving a goal, is really kind of the Christian way of understanding time. Because in Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity at least, we have this life in which to fulfill certain requirements, right, in order to get into heaven. And once you fulfill these requirements, then you're able to get into heaven. So, looking at it from this view, then your happiness lies in the future, But for Buddhists, there is no future, because we don't divide up the world. There's here and now. In the here and now lay the past and the future all together in now. So this is what we're encouraged to do when we think about interdependence, when we think about our connection to one another and to all things, that we are living in this world of infinity, of this eternal now, right at this very moment. And so, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, well, that sounds pretty good, but I still want to know where I go after I die. Right? Well, I saw this video on the New York Times website, and you can watch it yourself, and it's about, it's called psilocybin, which is it's a experimental drug to treat anxiety and depression that's made from hallucinogenic mushrooms. So if you search hallucinogenic mushrooms, psilocybin on the New York Times website and drug, you'll see this video. And when people took this drug, now people who took this drug were cancer patients, many of whom were terminally ill cancer patients, and they were suffering from different forms of depression. So one man talked about how he was consuming lots of alcohol and getting drunk, and other people talked about how they were so depressed or so sad or frozen by fear. And so many of them, not all of them, experienced, once they took this drug, they had an experience in which they felt a connection to the people around them, to the world around them, even to the whole entire universe. They felt a sense of oneness. And so to hear them talk, really to me, they sounded like Buddhists who had come to a deep understanding. And they used similar words that we like to use. For example, people talked about how now they were grateful for their life. They felt a great sense of appreciation for the people around them, a great connection to each other. And the man who was drinking a lot said he stopped drinking. And people who were depressed suddenly felt a weight lifted off their shoulders. And their fear and anxiety lessened, if not disappeared. And one woman summed it up by saying, I want for nothing. And another woman said, I no longer fear death, because they felt a great sense of peace. And so death was no longer a question for them. So it's very interesting. And this is the same kind of path that we are struggling to walk as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, to come to this kind of understanding without the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Okay, you got that? So, I think this question about what happens to Buddhists after we die is not the right question. It's not the right challenge for us. The challenge for us is, how do I understand my life? How do I live this life the most fully and the best way that I can? And we are prevented, we are challenged to live this life because of our ignorance, because of our desires, because of our ego. So really, this idea that there's a perfect place out there called heaven or the Pure Land is only feeding our desires, is only feeding our ego. So this is not the right way to look at this word, Pure Land. Instead, we are really encouraged by the words of Shinran to examine our life carefully, to understand our ignorance, and to really see a connection between us. And I think this is the key to confronting our fears and anxieties. We are reminded of the teachings of the Buddha through the words that Shinran encourages us to use, which is the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, which is a great reminder for us to walk on this path together with each other as fellow travelers. So let us, on this day of Ho-Onko, really think about the words of Shinran Shonin and the teachings of the Buddha. And really, because of Shinran Shonin, we are here at this Honganji temple together, walking this path. Please join me in Gasho. Namu Amida Butsu. Namu Amida Butsu. Namu Amida Butsu.